Welcome to the Red Web. It's been a while. I'm your host, Brad West, and my new permanent co-host, Greg Burrow. He's here on loan from our friends at Dragon Comics up on Anderson Lane. And I'm bad with directions. I could
it's on Anderson Lane.
Found my way out of there, Zach. And then, of course, Anastasia. Anna's going to be here as a new permanent co-host. Hopefully, in the future, we'll be able to start getting you some amazing guests on again. But actually, I don't think most of the time we need them. We decided that we need to just start filming our powwow sessions. So that's why today, with Bo, we're going to do the third part of our series on the evolution of the superhero archetype. Sorry we could get back into the studio to do this, but we figured, it's a good time to start talking comics and superheroes again and the culture of superheroes. As y'all recall, previously we had done Heroes of Myth, Ancient Heroes of Myth, Greek, Norse, Thor, etc. Then we moved over to the Western world, Europe, and Legends and Lore. We covered King Arthur and Robin Hood. And we even took some early New World American stuff with John Henry and Paul Bunyan and a lot of amazing stuff. So make sure you go back and check out those episodes. In the meantime, now we're going to do the turn of the century. Turn of the century and basically modern literature and the modern literary influences on superhero comics. Starting with, I think we went back all the way back to 1818. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now you're probably wondering, what does this have to do at all, if anything, with superheroes? And this is where we start planting the literary seeds of the idea of super sciences.
Super science,
and every mad scientist trope that comes after here owes their existence to Frankenstein, from Lex Luthor to Dr. Sivana and going on from there. And back
even
then,
Spider-Man.
Even Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus. I mean, how much of Spider-Man comes from mad super science? And in fact, there's a great parallel to the atomic age of Marvel. By the time you get to the 60s and everything's nuclear power and radiation, you got to go back in time and you got to go around the 1800s, and that's when you're thinking about electricity. And electricity was new and it was advanced, and so the idea of having all of these amazing things come from electricity and science were some of your first buildings and things. I know you're making a great point about Jekyll and Hyde.
Yes, it's like one of the big tropes that came out of Frankenstein and with Jekyll and Hyde is the idea that all of these characters are like tortured. It's like they're so into the thoughts of their own greatness that instead of it like building them up, it starts breaking them down and destroying them. And especially with Jekyll and Hyde, that's a big, he's fighting with the good, highest part of him versus the part of him that's just becoming cursed and all of this stuff.
And the duality of being is actually a really big theme that it goes through all the way up to the Hulk. Jekyll and Hyde straight up influences the Hulk. So that's amazing stories. And then you get to H.G. Wells, who creates so many scientific tropes that go over to superheroes that it's like a cascade. We couldn't even pinpoint one specifically. We're like, if you don't know H.G. Wells and you're watching this show, then I'm sorry.
I mean, from the time machine, going through time to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, with super science, dealing with, using science to be able to do things that normal people can't. Just lots of different tropes there.
Yeah, and then, even now we go back to the mid to late 1800s, and steampunk is such an influence on things, and it was the idea of what they thought the future was going to be. So that's a lot of really cool stuff coming from that time period. You get a little bit further down between Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein is the progenitor of the action-adventure romance novel, Three Musketeers. This is where you start getting the swashbuckling hero that, ends up leading into the pirates and things of that nature. But the Three Musketeers was one of the really big main ones that start adding that element into what would eventually become the modern superhero. Swashbuckler. Three Musketeers, Man in the Iron Mask. They were historical liberties, but they still had really interesting effects on literature as a whole. That's when, adventure and stuff started being big, and people started going and traveling the new continent and Africa. We're gonna touch on some parts there about that part of the world and the mysteries of the Amazon and Congo and stuff. You get to 1887 and Sherlock Holmes. Oh, you need to freeze him. Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, 1887, started in Strand Magazine, A Study in Scarlet. This is where you start getting into the ideas of the super intellect, the intellectual, the mystery solver, and the detective stories. So,
right. And it still feeds into the idea that their power isn't just like their brute strength; it's actually their intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the things in that the Sherlock Holmes had a mix of elements from science fiction and supernatural, and some of the fun aspects were him, debunking those in a kind of a Scooby-Doo kind of way, but it still planted the seeds and ideas for those elements and things to come. The really big ones were, what was known at the time as the Great White Hunter. People were fascinated. There was no television, there was no radio, and not everybody got books, but newspapers and pulp fictions, and what they would call were very cheap and easy to obtain literature and forms of entertainment. And a lot of these would take inspiration from explorers. Explorers were a huge thing back at the late 1800s. And a lot of those were the big game hunters, the wild hunters, bringing back trophies.
Journey to the center of the earth.
Yeah, that's a really good one, H.G. Wells one, that really had that influence. And a lot of magazines and newspapers printed a lot of these stories, including leading up to the Tarzan stories and stuff. But before that, we had the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is a really important piece of literary work, especially when it comes to the study of the superhero archetype. Scarlet Pimpernel by Emma Orski was written in 1905, but it was about the French Revolution. And it featured a character who was the very first character in literature to have two separate identities. The wealthy playboy and the rebellious masked adventurer, the Scarlet Pimpernel, and you were explaining how what he was doing. And
yeah, I haven't read the book in many, many years, but from what I remember, basically what it was is that he was rescuing people from France that basically got on the wrong side of the revolution. So the revolution in the books was very much like the Salem witch trials, where if somebody didn't like somebody, they would claim that they were part of the nobility, or they were sympathetic towards the nobility. So then they would be tried and everything like that. They'd be like chamber courts to get rid of the people so that they could get their land or their money or their position or anything like that. So Scarlet Pimpernel would come in and try to save them from the guillotine and stuff like that.
So yeah, and that one is a really big influence, especially on Zorro. So you get to Edgar Rice Burroughs, and we're talking about Africa and the influences of the mysteries of the explorers and stuff. He created two very, very important characters that lended a lot to the development of the comic book superhero. Those would be John Carter and Tarzan. Now, I was super, super disappointed in Disney when the John Carter movie, because I read all of the John Carter books, The Princess of Mars, Warlord of Mars, all of the series. They're incredible books. They're some of my favorite books when I was in middle school. I love them. And they are as deep and as popular back then as Tarzan is now, or Tarzan became. And everybody knows Tarzan, but hardly anybody remembers John Carter. And I think Disney just did a poor job of marketing it.
Well, also one of the things I loved about the pulp era is that all of them were friends, like H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, who of course lived here in Texas.
Well into the 70s, writing for Doctor Strange. Yeah, he created Shumagorath. Not in the 70s, or did you die before that? Oh, okay.
Suicide.
Oh,
In
wow.
his 20s.
Oh.
Well, his characters lived on.
Yeah, his characters lived on.
Because Marvel owns Conan now.
I'm sorry, you probably couldn't hear me because I was talking away, but Robert Howard actually committed suicide early in his life, and then other people took up the torch and wrote his books and stuff like that. But in the 70s, there was a big resurgence of Conan, and so at that point, that's when a lot of people started buying because, of course, Rosetta started doing covers of the Conan books, and that's one of the reasons why that became so big.
And then, but yeah, the John Carter stuff was another, like Conan, it was a very big influence on fantasy art and stuff. The reason that John Carter is important is he predates Superman by almost, 30 years, 20-something years?
Yeah, about 30
years.
20-something years. And John Carter was the opposite of Superman. He was a human who went to Mars, and he had super strength and speed and the ability to leap over time single out. This was a direct inspiration for years Schuster and Spiegel would do with Superman, but instead they had an alien come to Earth and have those powers. But it's the same premise. And John Carter, it was a really, if you haven't read the John Carter books, it's highly recommended. And then Tarzan. And
the movie's pretty good too. I enjoyed the movie.
I was sad that it didn't end up becoming a series, a franchise, because I would have liked to see some of the other stories that came out of that.
And one thing I'd really like to say really quick, the Howard Days, every year they do a big festival to honor Robert E. Howard and his hometown. They've actually turned his old house into a museum, and that's how they raise the money to keep for the upkeep of the house in the museum every year. And of course, because of COVID, they had to cancel this year. So you can make donations online to the Howard Foundation. You can look them up, Howard Days. I think it's called Howard Days.
Cool.
And you can help them out. That'd be amazing. Because Conan is, one of the greatest characters ever created. And if you haven't read the books, you need to read the books. The books are amazing.
Well, we can talk. We should do an episode of fantasy heroes. That would be really fun. That would be really fun. Yeah,
because Conan is not what you think he is. And read the books because he was super intelligent.
Yeah. But today we're talking about literary characters that led into the creation inspiration for what ended up becoming what we call now superheroes. I know outside of Tarzan was a really big one because he along with Zorro, they had a very short leap between publication date and silver screen. And this is in like the 1919, when the movie industry was first really getting into what we now think of as Hollywood. And they were starting to add, it wouldn't be long before everything had sound in it. Zorro was so popular as a movie that it spawned like well over 60 additional books. Yeah. Zorro was a great example of, and again, definitely inspired by Scarlet Pimpernel, the millionaire playboy Don de la Vega, who was actually in secret the hero of the people. So that was another really awesome development into stuff. And the Tarzan films, good gracious, they kind of did the same thing with Tarzan too.
Yeah. And I mean, I can't even tell you how many iterations of Zorro there have been. I mean, same thing with Tarzan. But Zorro, I mean, he was Douglas Fairbanks. He was did it in 1920, I believe, and then I think
the most recent is Antonio Banderas.
I know, and he did an amazing job.
It was
beautiful. Loved him. But I mean, even Disney had like a television series that was like super, super popular.
Mm-hmm. Same with Tarzan. Tarzan's had a lot of staying power, especially like the last version that just came out was amazing.
Love the last version.
I think
Margot Robbie's Jane.
Yeah, and Margot Robbie's Jane. And my favorite thing about the last one, we were looking into the history of Tarzan and the inspiration for the character. And there were a couple of different characters in some of the adventure books. There were supposed true accounts of a child who was lost in the jungle and came back and was a nobleman. But one of the inspirations for the character is William Charles Milden, who was the child that was lost. But one that I found interesting, George Washington Williams. George Washington Williams worked to help free slaves and oppressed from the Congo in the Belgian area. And the new Tarzan movie, actually, for the first time ever, they give credit to that character by having Samuel L. Jackson play this real life historical character integrated into the mythos of Tarzan directly, and it made an amazing story for that movie, amazing premise for that movie.
And Jane was amazing in that movie too.
Yeah.
I mean, everything about that movie I really loved.
It was really good. I mean, even the CGI gorillas weren't that bad.
Oh, really?
They were better than the CGI panthers in Black Panther.
I believe that.
I still hold a grudge that there were no actual Black Panthers in Black Panther movie.
It's like they had Disney
Not even
money.
just one. Disney had the money.
money.
You can get a Black Panther on camera. You can put a green screen behind a Black Panther in the cage at the zoo and then edit it. I don't care. They needed a real panther. All right, moving on. I feel strongly about this. But yeah, Zorro, Tarzan, these are all, you have your masked heroes, you have your adventurers, but then you get up to Prohibition era, and this is what inspires Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy is a really important character. Now, it can be argued whether or not Dick Tracy himself is a superhero, but his villains were definitely the template for many comic book tropes thereafter of having the colorful rogues gallery from Batman and Spider-Man and on. Dick Tracy was known for his crazy-ass villains, and also for super science would bring it back to gadgetry. The radio watch and the spy stuff. These are things that would go on to inspire Ian Fleming and the whole idea of James Bond with the super gadgets and stuff like that, who also could be kind of a superhero-y if you want to shoo him into there. But Dick Tracy, 1931 is when he first appears in the comics, and 1934 starts the radio serial. Now, this is a big era of entertainment that had a huge, probably the biggest impulse. This is where we hit this precipice that it's about to explode into superheroes, is radio serials. Again, the movie theaters were still kind of like, nobody had TVs in their houses and stuff like that. Not everybody could afford to go to see a movie. But the radio was something that the average person had in their home and could listen to. And so radio dramas were very popular, and the sci-fi adventures were at the top of it. That's where they would make all the money and the product placement. And Dick Tracy was a trendsetter. Dick Tracy in the Shadow.
And also, you have to realize that at this point, we start getting into the era where we start getting theaters all over the place. So kids would go and families would go to movie theaters and pay a nickel to watch all day, to watch movie serials and movies, and then there would be the Bugs Bunny cartoons and Mickey Mouse cartoons and different cartoons and things like that. So there'd be a whole bunch of different things that they could watch for a nickel. And so that was like a big deal. And
and the jump from radio serials to the movie serials was an easy one. At the time, the ones that dominated both Dick Tracy, Lone Ranger. A lot of people think the Lone Ranger, even though he was inspired by a real life person, a lot of people believe the Lone Ranger to have appeared in print beforehand, and he actually started off as a radio character, and to compete with like Zorro and such like that. Those are very, very popular and very easily. Lone Ranger was created as a radio serial because most of the studios at the time were still producing a lot of Western serials, and they needed to keep production costs down. And so Lone Ranger was an easy one for them to tie in to try and take some of the attention away from the crime noir characters like Dick Tracy, Shadow, and the Spider, etc. But Shadow was a really fun one too. I love the Alan Baldwin Shadow movie. A lot of people give that one crap, but it was super fun. It was super fun for how it integrated the history of the character from radio and the fantasy elements, and it definitely cemented the idea that the Shadow was a superhero character too. So I very much love that one.
Yeah, and then also when we're talking about radio, radio was, a lot of people just think about how much you watch your TV now. That was radio. radio was, I mean, at dinner table, everybody would listen to the radio. There would be radio stories, there would be radio news, there would be radio everything. And I actually, I cosplay as Captain America from the World War II era. And so what I do is I actually have I basically went to an archive that had a whole bunch of radio programs from that time period, including like fireside chats from President FDR and news broadcasts of D-Day, a whole bunch of stuff like that. So I can play those in the background whenever I'm at a convention appearance.
And even with the advent of television, radio would continue to hold on for quite a while. It's actually very interesting. Somehow we've gone through, my husband and I have gone through this spiral of 1930s, 1940s era television shows. Because we watched The Hollywood on Netflix, we've been watching Agent Carter again on Disney Plus, Penny Dreadful, City of Angels, and all. We keep catching all these shows, and it really amuses me. I'm watching. I forgot how integrated radio was, but like the characters were getting their news on the radio. They were on the edge. All of the action and the international. That's how people got everything. That was the social media of the time. So
you can't talk about radio serials without talking about H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
And how much of an impact that had, because people thought that was really happening. People went out and shot water towers thinking they were the alien, the alien ships and stuff. Mm-hmm. And they actually redid it in the 70s in Central America somewhere, and the people got so angry they burned down the radio station. Because they were so terrified about what.
It's really fun the impact that radio had on stuff. It's kind of like modern day, podcasting. It's hard to believe that people will sit and listen to that stuff all day long, but they did in a completely different way. Another one that it wasn't necessarily radio, but it kind of paralleled. It was kind of in the vein of Dick Tracy. Was the Rocket Men of the early 1900s. This is a subset of the sci-fi genre that is probably the highest on the list of influencing superheroes. I had an argument with an uncle one time who just couldn't accept that Superman is sci-fi. And he's like, no, superheroes and sci-fi are not the same thing. I'm like, Superman is an alien from another planet. I mean, it's very clear that it's a sci-fi premise.
And he uses alien technology.
Right.
So
it's a
crystal
sci-fi.
technology.
It's as sci-fi as it gets. But Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon were huge for radio. Even after Superman was created in 1939, they were still dominating the radio serials and for publication and newspaper syndication. So this kind of hero, even though not technically what we would consider a superhero, was definitely folded into that group. I know, like, by the time we get through the Marvel age of comics and then the Bronze Age, they kind of dump them together. So nowadays, your sci-fi and your supernatural and your crime noir characters are all in the same universe, So Batman regularly interacts with, Sherlock Holmes type characters. One of my favorite characters from DC, Adam Strange, is very, very much influenced by the Rocket Men stories of the early 1900s.
And they even take the radio serials, like there was a radio serial where Superman smashes the Klan, and it's actually just this year been made into a comic book.
That's a really good one. If you can get to check that out, it's I'm really wanting to get that. Actually, I meant for you to bring a copy of that. I feel like I dropped the ball on that. That would have been a perfect one to showcase Superman smashes the Klan.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's actually they adopted the transcripts of a radio serial from back in the day. A lot of things were like anti-Nazi back then, and worse than just anti-Nazi, which we didn't find, but also anti-Asian. That's one of the things that I found interesting when we were looking at some of the things, the early radio serials and stuff. The villains were Asian because of the Japanese involvement in World War II. And so a lot of Americans were xenophobic about Asians in America. Some fun things that I found on Green Hornet.
Yeah.
Original Green Hornet was Japanese, and they changed it to Korean. And Chinese.
Because Bruce Lee was Chinese.
No. He was Japanese, and the first serials they changed him to Korean because that actor was Korean.
And then they changed it.
But then in the 60s, because Bruce Lee was Chinese, they changed it to Chinese. So yeah, that's always some kind of like fun things. The first Batman villain to appear in the very first Batman serial was, and we're gonna do a thing on the serials too, black and white serials. So those are gonna be fun. But
what's even more insulting is how many times the Asian people were actually played by white.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I love, if you, we were talking about, like I was just saying a minute ago, Hollywood.
We're not even going to get to the breakfast Tiffany Mickey Green.
Yeah.
No, Hollywood on Netflix was telling you about it. They actually addressed that, but it's really cool. If you get a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. It's a segue, I know, but it's off topic. But it's basically Hollywood that could have been. It's basically what if, like, you know, the women and the Jews and the blacks and the gays teamed up together and took over Hollywood, and it went in a different direction. It's actually a really interesting show to watch. But
right. And it would kind of tie in thematically, because once we got into the Prohibition era, that's where all the stories steered from, oh, we're fighting the government, or oh, we're fighting something of power, and now we're fighting a mysterious seedy underground stuff.
Right.
Just, it's like, you know,
the monster films.
And the Shanghai tunnels versus the bootleg tunnels, and that's a lot of the, and those elements they made it into a lot of that literature. One movie serial of note is one called The Spider's Web. This predates Superman by a year or so, and so it predates technically superheroes. And it's interesting because even though it is the Spider is a knockoff of the Shadow, he actually beat the Shadow to the silver screen by several years, and can very well be considered the first masked crime fighter to appear in live action. And another one, it's the same year, is The Fighting Devil Dogs. Now, this is still when they were doing anti-war sentiment. So you had soldier films and soldier serials. This was a serial about a group of soldiers. But this one is interesting to note because of the villain. The super villain is the first occurrence of a movie super villain in a costume. In fact, it is so prominent that it is, if you're in the know and you study the history of Star Wars, it actually influenced George Lucas's vision of Darth Vader. If you go back and look at Fighting Devil Dogs, the lightning.
It looks exactly like it.
You can see straight up where George Lucas picks that up. And we're going to talk about that more when we do our black and white serial episode, because there's a lot of fun history just in those alone. But the two black and white serials of note that lead up to the creation of superheroes, definitely Spider's Web and Fighting Devil Dogs. So, are there anything else pre-1938 that we missed that's really of interest?
I can't remember when Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers did.
They were before Superman.
Yeah. Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, of course, were huge. I know that Marlene Dietrich actually got Jimmy Stewart a stand-up of Flash Gordon.
Oh,
to try to get on his good side during a production because she knew that he really liked the Flash Gordon.
So yeah, the Flash Gordon in the syndication was printed in publication in newspapers and such. Yeah, definitely predates Superman. Ironically, though, the Flash Gordon movies and Buck Rogers movies even much later didn't come until after Superman. And that's his own episode because there's so much rich history in just the serials themselves. But basically, so to recap, you have 1818, your super science of Frankenstein. So you get your super science, and then that pushes into 1844, Three Musketeers, swashbuckling action heroes, which merges into 1887, Sherlock Holmes, and your super intellect. And 1905, your dual identity, and 1912, your superpowers. Once you mush all those together, you get what we consider the modern superhero. So it seems like a roundabout
evolution. I mean, of course, like we talked about in the last few episodes. When you go back to mythology with, Hercules and with different gods and Thor and demigods and all that kind of stuff, all these kind of influence the stories that come after them. And it's really interesting to see the evolution of the hero's journey, especially if you get into Joseph Campbell's writings and stuff like that. And how, especially going into the Eastern philosophy and Eastern story elements and things like that. It's essentially how all this evolves.
Which is really, it is really fun to see, especially when we're doing our research for some of these things, some of the inspirations from these individual characters and who they're based on. It was fun to note that both the Lone Ranger and Tarzan were actually based on real life Black historical characters.
Yeah.
And then who else? Some of what now is considered cultural appropriation at the time before World War II, a lot of the Eastern influences on stuff that people were really fascinated by the ideas of Eastern mysticism and stuff like that. It's why you get things like the Shadow and some of those characters from back then. There was a lot of that going through there. So,
well, and at least with Eastern cultures, it ties back into Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde, where really the fascination or the thing we're trying to project is messing with things that we don't totally understand. It's like, for those East Asian cultures, this stuff is normal.
Right.
Stuff we think about. But for us who grew up as it's like primarily Christian nation, this is new for us. This is completely fascinating. And it's like, it's really only appropriative because, we didn't fully understand it. It's like, and this stuff started influence our understanding of those cultures.
right.
It's like, because there's a lot of othering that kind of happens where you're like, oh, so you're into these weird things.
Right.
Cool.
It's actually a really interesting idea to maybe for an episode jump back and try to find different characters that were actually based off of real people. Pi, for example, was actually based off of a real sailor.
And the image is just uncanny.
It's really scary how much he looks just like the cartoon character. But yeah, there's a lot of characters like that are based off of real people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We should delve deeper into that.
That would be a fun episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some of the ones, it's like, I know I want to say Dick Tracy is based on somebody real as well, if not a combination of people. Some of them are combinations of people for sure. And
right. Well, and it'll be interesting to see, especially now that we know like who John Carter and Tarzan are inspired by. Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting to see like, oh well, it's like the inspirations look like this. So how did we come to what we modernly know as Tarzan and John Carter now?
Well, one of the fine things I find most interesting about Edgar Rice Burroughs at the time, he came back from exploration, and he had injured himself, and he couldn't find work. He honestly hated writing. He thought writing, especially fiction writing, was pretty much the lowest level of anything you could do.
Oh, didn't they all at the time?
He felt it was beneath him, and he broke down and wrote these stories for a publication, this magazine, and he didn't even want to get credit for them to start with. And they became so popular, and they started demanding him. He got to the point where he hated it, and by the time they had collected enough to publish a book, he actually flat out refused to publish the book. It took them a lot to convince him to publish the Tarzan and John Carter books. But Tarzan specifically, Tarzan was so popular, and he just did not want even to be associated with it. But eventually he had to suck, okay, well, this is paying my bills. But I found that to be kind of interesting. A lot of those characters, one of them that has endured on in one way or another is oh my gosh, Alan Quartermain. Alan Quartermain.
Yeah.
He was a big one of the characters. I know that they tried to politically align him a little bit in later days. Like the version that Sean Connery played in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, they were trying to push the idea that, you know, he respected the land of Africa, that he was part of Africa and stuff like that, you know. But some of the earlier stories, you're like, you're raiding these, you know. And these are definitely influences on the Indiana Jones villains. When you see, you know, Indiana, definitely Spielberg's idea of taking that character and that trope and turning it into more noble than it was originally.
Belongs in a museum.
Yes, it belongs in a museum.
But one of the things I really got fascinated about these guys, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, they were all writing for pulp magazines at the same time, and they were very avid letter writers. They would write letters all the time, and so they were talking to each other all the time. They were talking to fans all the time, because you know that was the way they communicated back then. So Robert Howard. I mean, his letters are amazing. I mean, he talks about how, you know, people are asking him, you know, when are you going to do another Conan story? We want another Conan story.
Oh,
and he's
no.
like, and he in one letter he's talking about how he doesn't plan a Conan story. What happens is he'll be sleeping at night, and all of a sudden he'll wake up, and Conan waking him up and says, you know, I am here to tell you a tale of, you know, of glory. And so, you know, he gets him on his typewriter and makes him write the entire story. So he writes the entire story while Conan's, you know, draining a mug of mead, you know, while he's like, you know, making him tell the story of Conan, you know. And that's the only way he could ever get a Conan story out.
Who is it that did the Swamp Thing story that we were talking about on the Halloween episode?
Are you talking about
The Swamp Thing?
my mind is gone blank.
That's who I thought you were talking about. We were talking about Robert Howard. That's where I got confused.
Yeah.
Oh,
I somehow crossed those.
Bernie Wrightson.
Bernie Wrightson. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
amazing.
All right, that's off subject, but that's who I wished
Yeah.
in my head. That's why I was off, because I got Bernie Wrightson and Bernie Howard. Now, that's
Bernie
me out,
Wrightson's amazing. You need to check out this artist. You don't know who he is.
It's genre stuff. So anyway, but,
His pen and ink stuff is just best in the business.
But yeah. So anyway, your ideas on some of the prehistory characters.
well, it's like the one fun thing I had that happened with the Scarlet Pimpernel is that it wasn't just, oh, we have a secret identity. It's like they really start delving into identity and like their personal struggles. So it becomes, oh, only is this like the regular person is the regular person, the superhero is the alter. It's, oh, you know, it's like the superhero is his real self and the alter is whatever he has to do to make himself feel safe.
Right.
It's like, because at least in that story, if they knew he was a master swordsman and a master of disguise and very clever, they would automatically guess that it's him. And so he had to actively be like, I'm gonna be a dumb playboy who's not really doing much, so he could separate his real self from the whole situation as far as possible.
Yeah, I really love the A&E television miniseries.
Right.
Yeah, and he had his little. It's like, and I mean, following that, you have the married band of friends that he could like. He couldn't trust anybody with the secret identity, but he could trust these people.
Right.
It's like, and some of the stories focus around the struggle of him trying to keep his identity secret.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, the Disney animators very specifically modeled Darkwing Duck after Scarlet Pimpernel.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
Darkwing
I love
Duck
that.
is specifically inspired. It wasn't until later they started making him more like the Shadow or other characters. He was originally meant to be Scarlet Pimpernel. What I think my favorite thing about Scarlet Pimpernel is that it was created by a woman. And so, any of you out there who, even in the back of your mind, have even the tiniest bit of thought that comics aren't for girls, oh, they started it. I'm just gonna say.
Frankenstein, Mary Shelley.
horror movies are, they started it. So give props there. So I find that particularly interesting too. And yeah, you don't really have a lot of women creators after that really have it. I mean, even today, people tend to think of the great female writers of yore, wrote political satire and stuff like that, not adventures and heroes and stuff. So
right, well, and the real transition comes into like it's like when we talked about this before. It's like you're trying to figure out who the person is and who the enemy is. It's like a lot of this is people dealing with their own self, and then after a while it becomes like, oh, we're dealing with the issues of war, or we're dealing with prohibition and the enemy is like authority, or the enemy is this mysterious underground stuff.
Right.
It's like it is really fun to look at from historics, because seeing the timeline, you can exactly put, between 1912 and 1918, it's like we had World War I going, and there was a lot of colonization still going and people fighting for independence at that same time. And so you've got these characters who are these like noble hunters coming in and being like, let me civilize you.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting to look at.
And that started the trend really getting to where entertainment wise, we're not getting everything with the Great White Savior. That's one of the things that we've been struggling for a long time. And even when I was growing up, all of the good, urban movies that, featured Black people, I mean, it was still like the main character, like, what was the one with Michelle Pfeiffer? It was a good movie, and, great, she's standing up for them and helping them, but, it's like, it still comes down to it's a white person coming in and saving them.
Oh, no.
And what was that movie with Michelle Pfeiffer in it, where she played the substitute teacher or something?
I'm slowly knowing what you're talking about. This is going to haunt my
Yeah, there was a lot of those. But there was a lot of those kind of movies when I was growing up. It's like anything like me as a white kid seeing of those cultures and movies, it was still, ultimately when it came down to it, it was like, well, a movie that we watched recently that I love, my husband and I love is Hidden Figures. It's an amazing movie, but, as much as I love Kevin Costner, it still puts a craw in me that's like, okay, good for you, yay, Kevin Costner or whatever his character, but at the same time, it's like, I still feel like we have too many movies where, in order to sell it, we have to put that character in there.
Right. For context, you're talking about the bathroom scene, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's like, so what he's talking about, there's a scene in Hidden Figures. They've already had this struggle back and forth where one of the characters, because she can't go to the bathroom in the building she's in because it's whites only, she has to basically run across her campus to that bathroom and then come back. And after a while, Kevin Costner's character is like, what in the world are you doing? And she has to admit, I have to go pee. And so what he does is he has a moment where he like trots in and stands up for him and breaks down the sign. And that's supposed to be like a big, beautiful applause moment. And it kind of minimizes the work that these girls had to put in for the equality, because all they're going to look at is
Kevin Costner saving them.
Yeah,
and the reason it bugs me is that at the time that the movie came out, there was an interview with actually a couple of the women, and they were saying, they're like, I mean, that's an interesting scene or all, but that wasn't really how it was. She's like, he's like, yes, there was still segregation and everything, but like everybody was so busy and so focused on working on the work and doing the numbers that was a trivial that they actually didn't have. She didn't have that problem, and it's like I just kind of felt like to write that in. It just kind of felt weird. But that goes backwards to when you go back to the original heroes. You got Tarzan, who definitely is inspired by, in part, this Black character or this Black historical person, and instead they write him out completely. And when it comes down to it, Tarzan is the white baby raised by the apes and then saves the African people. And the tribes all look
bridges
to
the
him,
divide.
and he bridges the divide. Which is why I love the new Tarzan movie so much, is because of Samuel L. Jackson's character. I think he was undersold in it.
Right. Even with Zorro, you can kind of argue that, because it's like they do cast POC characters, but usually when that finally happens, that it becomes that big argument of like, but what should he be?
Well, yeah, of course, because you have the distinction, especially the time period between Mexican and Spanish is what they're trying to make there, and yes, he's a Spanish nobleman. I think that's why the Antonio Banderas ones did so well, and it was actually very well publicized at the time. He was the first person of actual Hispanic descent to play Zorro. Yeah.
Spanish, yeah.
Because he's from Spain.
He is from Spain.
He is. And it doesn't help that him and Catherine Zeta-Jones are two beautiful people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
still.
I do have to say really quickly, I'm very glad I grew up when I did, because I grew up with Sesame Street and I grew up with Electric Company, and so those I really wish more people grew up watching those shows, because those shows are amazing.
Right? There's still time. They still have their YouTube channel, and it's very wholesome and cute.
Yeah. What about the Sesame Street on HBO still? I mean, I know that they've got Elmo.
Actually, they've got the whole cast doing episodes online right now.
Online?
It's really cute. So it's like since they're doing the whole like COVID personal thing, it's like everybody got to take home their puppets. And everybody gets to sit down and vlog as their own puppets, and it's the cutest thing ever.
Last Sesame Street thing I saw was my husband Bo brought up. What was it? Lip sync battle with Big Bird. Have you seen it?
No.
Oh my gosh!
Well, I know that last Saturday.
Lip sync battle with Big Bird. It was amazing.
I know. I think last Saturday they actually had a special on racism.
Oh yeah.
I believe it. It's like they've been getting. It's like it. I liked it when I grew up. Like everyone has some positive memory with Sesame Street, but the last 10 years they have been showing up hardcore. And even though I know they got bought out by HBO, I still really appreciate it for all of the big strides.
Well, I mean, even back in the day, I remember when I don't know if you remember Mr. Store.
Yes.
But he died. The actor who played him died,
yes.
and they actually dealt with that in the show.
Was the most gut-wrenching episode.
Yeah.
So we should definitely do something about children's superheroes.
Absolutely.
Well, that's one of the things I was just talking about recently, is that I was very thankful DC was actually starting to come out with books and stuff like that for kids again. There's Diana, Princess of Themyscira. I highly suggest it. It's about her when she's a little girl on Themyscira. And it's before she becomes Wonder Woman. And she's just this little girl, and she's having to deal with loneliness because she's the only little kid. So it's really, really good, and I really enjoyed it a lot. And there's a lot more that they were starting to do like that, with little books like that, where they're actually dealing with, they're starting to do kids stuff again.
Mm-hmm.
But this coming Wednesday, they're coming out, or I guess in some places Tuesday, the Adventures of Batman. They're I guess it's the New Adventures of Batman, where they're bringing the animated Batman back in comic book form.
Mm-hmm.
The Bruce Timm animated Batman animated series.
But it's safe for kids except for the ads. The ads in the book are bad. I mean, there's they're advertising for 80th anniversary, and it's the cover, I guess, is blood all over it with Joker holding a crowbar.
Oh no.
Question. I had seen some solicitations for the new animated Batman book because they're introducing Deathstroke into the animated series. Do they call him Deathstroke?
I haven't read it.
Because I always found that funny, because the original Teen Titans cartoon, the censors were not allowed to call him Deathstroke because it was death.
Right, that sounds so dark.
Yeah, so that's why he was called just Slade on the Teen Titans.
That makes so much more sense.
They never actually called him Deathstroke because Disney wouldn't allow it. They called him Slade.
When you say it out loud, I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, which is funny because I have,
but it worked.
I have, but I have the Lego superhero, the Lego DC superhero stuff, and it's got Batman going. It shows Batman studying under his sensei at the same temple as Slade Wilson, and she gives Batman the name Batman because he listens so well, even when he's not watching. But she tells Slade, he's like, "You're so bad, you make me want to have a stroke. I'm gonna die. I'm gonna call you Deathstroke." And the sensei calls him Deathstroke because he's so horrible at fighting. And I'm like, how did Deathstroke not get to be on Teen Titans? But it's in Lego Batman. It's in Lego.
I mean, Lego Batman. That's always an interesting one to deal with because that was not the story I thought was going to happen.
Right.
It's like
the story you thought was going to happen.
I walked in like, this is going to be a kids movie, and then it's like, nope. There's a lot of different things that happen.
It's amusing. I remember after that came out because we cosplayed the 66 Batman and Robin, and right after the movie came out, we were at Comicpalooza in Houston, and one of my friends, her little girl, who I hadn't seen her in like years, and not since she was talking, and then when she's like, "You're No Pants Robin. You're No Pants Robin."
Aww.
You're Robin with no pants. I mean, yes, I'm the Robin with no pants.
You're just like, all right.
No, I know. That's what she called me. She's like, "You're the No Pants Robin." I'm like, "Yes."
It's like the kids are all right. So the kids are all right. I love it.
Didn't say the darkest thing.
Right.
Right.
So anyway, I hope you're enjoying the show, and we're gonna start being live every Tuesday at 7:30. Next week we're gonna talk. We're gonna get down to business, and we're gonna talk about aspects of the business of comic books. If you're keeping up with the news, recently DC Comics has cut ties with their distribution, Diamond Comics distributors, who's pretty much like the universal distributor of comic books to the primary market, or what is called the right market. And that is opposed to bookshops and stuff. We're talking about comic book shops. So that's made a big stir, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to do that live from Dragon Slayer, so that's going to be hopefully,
right? Maybe.
You need to ask first.
Yes. We're going to hold it out. It'll happen. Yeah. Ask forgiveness, not permission. But we're going to work towards that, and we're going to try and bring you some more fun content. We're going to see what we can get away with. I'd love to do some reviews of those black and white serials for you guys. There's so much rich history and factoids and information and trivia that just make them just hilarious. We're going to see if we can MST3K those puppies for you.
And it may be a separate. It may not be a red web. It may be something.
Hey, you know what we can do?
Especially if we start doing all of them.
Do all of them, but look for more content. I mean, we've got a really good group here. Bring some other people in for fun and everything. But if you get a chance, make sure you're checking out our group.
When we do New Tracy, we got to bring in.
Matt, yes, we have to bring Matt. We can't not. He'll be hurt. But make sure you're checking our parent group, the Kaiju Labs Media. They are the ones who sponsor us and put up with all of our crazy and encourage our creativity.
And if there's anything you want us to talk about and to explore, please just send us information. Tell us what you want us to talk about.
Right? We're always open to suggestions.
Yeah, and if you're one of those fact checkers and I said something wrong, tell me. We'll correct it.
Right?
Let us know. All this is coming from our brain. So
we're trying to go by memory from what we studied last week. In this past
week. A lot of it is like, something we've just grown up believing. So
right, and stuff we haven't read in like years.
Yeah,
it's like I was like what 12 when I read the Scarlet Pimpernel.
That's basically where I was at. So everything most of my knowledge.
That's with me.
Shows and stuff.
The John Carter books. I was in middle school and I read all of those, and I remember a lot of it. But for some reason, in my brain, they were way more naked. Serious. They were. I remember that, like on Mars, because of the heat and the dryness, and like they didn't wear anything. And the description of Deja Torres, she was wearing nothing but her jewelry. And then, of course, Disney. Even when they first announced that Disney was going to be making this movie. I'm like, how is Disney going to make this movie? Because like they're all naked on this planet. I think what I saw was a lot of the Vallejo, Boris Vallejo art, the fantasy art from Heavy Metal Magazine and kind of stuff. I think that's what I remember seeing. So of course that was over sexualized, and maybe that's what influenced my brain. But yeah, when the movie came out, I was like, and then of course Bo went and looked it up, and it's like, we weren't really that naked. I'm like, I don't know, but that's what I think. Anyway, if you read the comic books, there's two versions of the comic book that came out right around the time of the movie. Disney published theirs through Marvel, an actual John Carter based on the movie, and then because John Carter is in public domain at this point, Dynamite Comics. The Dynamite Comics or Boom Comics, one of the two.
There's Zenescope.
There's Zenescope now?
Zenescope's been doing Deja Taurus for a long time.
Okay.
So I don't know if it paid.
So it's whoever does Vampirella is doing it, and they did it.
Zenescope.
Yeah, and they did a actual
I think
to the books actual titles, Princess of Mars and Mother of Mars, and so and those ones are definitely more naked.
Yeah.
So you have your media to choose from. It's fascinating. Again, I'm really disappointed that Disney was handled John Carter because it is so.
Well, I think that the big thing they handled was the promotions of the movie, because I think that the movie itself was actually really good.
Well, real quick, I think what I remember reading back at the time, Disney had just done a movie called Mars Needs Moths.
Yes.
And it flopped so bad that one of the executives, now this could just be hearsay, Hollywood rumors or whatever, but supposedly one of the executives demanded that they take the word Mars out of it because that's why they thought it failed, was because nobody wanted to watch Mars. But then what came up is nobody understood what the hell this movie was about because, John Carter's very
Well, you guys take care. Thanks for watching.
Yep, and catch you next week. Same red time, same red channel.
Okay, bye.